Cuban communism. It has been a hotly debated topic ever since the beginning of Fidel Castro's rule. It has been very controversial among many people. The capitalist empire to the north of his island, the United States, declares him as an evil dictator who leads a backwards country and has a backwards regime. However, in the south and the Cubans he rules, he is considered a hero, especially among the socialist leaders of the Latino and African nations, and the downtrodden people of the world who cry out to receive the basic human needs that Cubans enjoy every day. I am here to evaluate Cuban communism, what it has done, where it has come from, and where it can go from here, as well as where it would be without it. To begin this journey, I invite you to come with me and look at the Cuban Revolution, look at how Cuban communism began, and perhaps learn a little bit about its leader, Fidel Castro.
Se habla con frecuencia de los derechos humanos, pero hay que hablar también de los derechos de la humanidad. ¿Por qué unos pueblos han de andar descalzos para que otros viajen en lujosos automóviles? ¿Por qué unos han de vivir 35 años para que otros vivan 70? ¿Por qué unos han de ser míseramente pobres para que otros sean exageradamente ricos? Hablo en nombre de los niños que en el mundo no tienen un pedazo de pan.
Now, the main battles of the Cuban Revolution happened between December 1956 and January 1959. But the Cuban Revolution was said to have really begun on the Moncada barracks incident, after some poorly armed Cuban rebels attacked the Moncada barracks in Santiago and the barracks in Bayamo on July 26, 1953. Among those rebels that attacked the barracks were both Fidel Castro and his brother Raul Castro, and they were captured shortly after the bombings. In Fidel Castro's trial, he spoke for 4 hours in his defense and ended with his famous quote, "Condemn me, it does not matter. History will absolve me." Castro was then sentenced to 15 years in prison. However, due to political pressure, the Batista regime was forced to free all political prisoners in Cuba, and this included Raul and Fidel Castro. They were then exiled to Mexico, where they received training from the leader of the Spanish Republican forces, Alberto Bayo, and it was during this period that Fidel Castro met with Che Guevara. 1 year after his exile, on the 2nd of December 1956, Fidel Castro and his rebels landed in Cuba on the Gran Mayat. They landed in the southeastern region of Cuba and made their way in the Sierra Mastor Mountains. However, during their trek, they were attacked by Batista's armies. Most of their rebels were killed in this attack. However, Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, and Raul Castro all survived and fled into the mountains. Castro and his comrades would remain dormant for some time as they consolidated their power base in the mountains. However, not all was well for Batista on his island. On March the 13th, 1957, a group of revolutionaries, the Student Anti-Communist Revolutionary Directorate, attacked the presidential palace, attempting to assassinate Batista and decapitate the regime. The attack resulted in most of the revolutionaries' death and Batista's continued rule over the country. However, because of this attack, the United States imposed an embargo on the government and recalled their ambassadors from Cuba. This significantly weakened Batista's political regime and mandate of the government. Batista often had to resort to lethal methods in order to keep the peace in his cities after this. Fidel Castro then used this time to push his advantage and staged several successful attacks against Batista's outlying garrisons, as well as irregulars continued to harass his army from the foothills. Raul and Guevara then helped Fidel Castro consolidate his political power, and eventually the mountains fell into control of Fidel Castro. While Batista's army numbered in the range between somewhere of 30,000 and 40,000 men, and Fidel Castro had a mere 200, nearly every time Batista and Fidel Castro's armies met, Fidel and his revolutionaries were victorious. The Cuban military was remarkably ineffective. This was, of course, a growing problem for Batista, and this was only accentuated by the arms embargo enforced by the United States. The Cuban Air Force was losing power rapidly, and they could not be replaced without spare parts from the United States. With the growing power of the revolutionary and rebel groups in the mountains, Batista was finally left with no choice but to attack. He called this attack Operation Verano, which consisted of something about 12,000 soldiers, more than half of which were new, untrained recruits. In a series of small-scale battles, the Cuban army was eventually defeated by Castro's determined soldiers. In fact, in one battle, the Battle of La Plata, which lasted 10 days, from July 11th to July 21st, Castro's forces defeated an entire battalion of Batista's army, capturing 240 men while losing only 3 revolutionaries. Things began to turn for Castro, however. At the Battle of Las Mercedes, he almost lost his army of 300 men. His forces were pinned down by the superior numbers of Batista's army. On the 1st of August, Castro asked for a temporary ceasefire and was granted it. Over the next 7 days, negotiations took place, and Castro used this time to escape from the trap, and by the 8th of August, his army had escaped back into the mountains. Operation Verano had ended up as a failure for the Batista government. After Batista's humiliating defeat with Operation Verano, this was the perfect time for Fidel Castro to counterattack, and he did on August 21st, 1958. His forces descended from the mountains, using weapons smuggled by plane or taken from the Cuban military, and won a series of major victories. The major Castro victory at Gusa and the succeeding capture of several towns consolidated victory on the Cunto Plains. Meanwhile, 3 columns, one of which under Che Guevara, continued westward towards the provincial capital of Santa Clara. One of these columns was ambushed and destroyed, however the surviving 2 continued to move towards their objective and met up with other revolutionary forces. The combined revolutionary forces then went on to win several key battles until December 31st, where they eventually entered Santa Clara and fought the Battle of Santa Clara. The battle for Santa Clara was a scene of great confusion. Che Guevara's forces were vastly outnumbered by the Cuban army. However, due to support from peasants and citizens alike, Che Guevara was able to overcome and defeat the Cuban army and take the city. After a series of skirmishes in the cities, most of the army garrisons had been wiped out, and those that remained surrendered, and it ended as a decisive victory for the rebels and was the last nail in the coffin for the Batista government. Upon hearing of his defeat at Santa Clara, Batista then fled Cuba to the Dominican Republic. Cuba, upon hearing of Batista's flight, began negotiations with what Cuban army commanders remained. Most of the army's commanders agreed to lay down their weapons and let Fidel Castro and his rebel forces enter cities unopposed. On January the 2nd, Che Guevara's forces entered the capital city of Havana. They received absolutely no opposition or resistance on their journey from Santa Clara to Havana. On January the 8th, Fidel Castro entered the city as well after a long victory march. This ended the Cuban Revolution and began Fidel Castro's reign as leader of Cuba.